What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHawks42 on the internet, and today we have another edition of the Overthinking MTG Podcast, the unscripted, unedited show where we look at individual Magic cards and talk about them for maybe a little longer than is strictly appropriate in some cases. But today we have a whole suite of cards that I think do deserve some time, and those are the cards featuring the bad guys from the upcoming Lord of the Rings set. Now, I'm not going to be looking at every single one, but I picked a handful that I think are going to be meaningful and potentially impactful in various formats. And I gotta start with the big man himself, Sauron the Dark Lord. Now, Sauron is being represented in a couple of cards in this set. This particular one is kind of the biggest, baddest of them, as far as just like the most expensive mana-wise and the splashiest, I would say. Definitely just glancing at it, it looks to me like it's meant to be a face of like a commander deck, but it's not. This is actually going to be appearing in the main set. And there is another Sauron that will be in the commander product, but in any event, Sauron the Dark Lord is 3 blue, black, red. For a 7/6 Avatar Horror, 7/6 for 6, with Ward, sacrifice a legendary artifact or legendary creature. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, amass Orcs 1. Whenever an army you control deals combat damage to a player, the ring tempts you. And whenever the ring tempts you, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw 4 cards. Honestly, top to bottom, everything that this card is doing is awesome, in my opinion. So it's got the ward, where the opponent has to sacrifice a legendary artifact or legendary creature just to target Sauron. So already they're at a disadvantage. In a way, that I think is kind of capturing Sauron's ability to, or the fact that Sauron's life force is tied to the ring itself. You know, the ring has to be destroyed in order for Sauron to be defeated. And as a result, you have to give up something very powerful and precious in order to target him. Theoretically, the One Ring itself, you know, which is a legendary artifact in this set. But for the gameplay purposes, they make it any legendary. So, okay. But that's kind of fun. I like that. And then whenever an opponent casts a spell, you amass Orcs 1. That ability is going to be shockingly good. Shockingly good, especially in multiplayer settings. In Commander, you are just gonna, you're gonna amass so many times. If you're not familiar with amass, it was a mechanic that was introduced in War of the Spark when Nicol Bolas had an army of Lazotep Gollums, zombies from Amonkhet. And the way that the amass mechanic worked is you create an army, and then every time you amass, you put a token, or a counter rather, on an army you control. If you do not have an army, you create a 0/0 army, then put a counter on it. And in the case of amass Orcs, it functions exactly the same way, in that if you already have an army, you put a counter on it, and then it becomes an orc. If you do not have an army, you create a 0/0 orc army and then put counters on it. It's that simple. So if you leverage amass orcs alongside normal amass, you do create, like, they work off of each other because they're both armies and both care about armies specifically. But if you amass orcs, you make orcs. If you're originally amass, actually, I believe the army becomes orcs regardless. I think we would actually lose the zombie type from amass. I need to look that up and do a separate video on that. But in any event, that's a very fringe case that probably isn't going to be relevant in most cases, but you never know. But when you amass orcs, you put a +1/+1 counter on an orc army you have, is what's happening. And so with Sauron, the Dark Lord, every time your opponents cast spells, your army gets bigger. It just does, and that's really freaking cool. In a 4-player pod, as you're going around the table, players cast a ton of spells, and so you're just going to be adding dice to your dudes a lot. It's pretty shocking, and I think that has an opportunity to get really, really big. But wait, there's more. Whenever an army you control deals combat damage to a player, the ring tempts you. Now you'll note the ring tempts you is a mechanic that is just 100% upside. You get this emblem, and you dub one of your creatures a ring bearer. And so you can do some crazy things with that. So Sauron being tied to the ring tempt you mechanic also flavorfully makes perfect sense because Sauron and the ring are intertwined. It's just their deal. So of course the ring mechanics are going to be relevant for this card. And then whenever the ring tempts you, you may discard your hand if you do draw 4 cards. Discarding your hand and drawing 4 is kind of a big deal. You can just cast out a whole bunch of stuff first, empty your hand, then get the ring to tempt you in one way or another, such as, your army connecting or using any other any number of cards that allow the ring to tempt you, and you just end up seeing a ton of cards. If you have spells that allow the ring to tempt you, you just cast it out, ring tempts you, dump your however many cards you have in your hand. If it's like 1 or 2, you're more than happy to take that trade because you're going up on cards. And you're seeing more cards. You're also loading your graveyard. You may have some good reanimation synergies, that kind of thing. So this card is frankly cracked in half. For a 6-drop, you get a ton of value. And it's in a lot of ways that Grixis likes. You make a token, it grows. This guy is a 7/6 that protects himself. Again, in Commander, you have a 7-power commander here. That means 3 shots from this guy is a kill shot to one of your opponents because of commander damage. So there are a lot of, you could build a Sauron the Dark Lord, Voltron strategy in Commander, and it could theoretically work, which that might be one of the lower power ways to build this card, to be honest, but still, you could do it. Yeah, all in all, I think this card is just really strong. Like, for a 6-drop, you get a ton of value. And I think the ring tempting you, drawing you additional cards, and that orc army, you're going to get a lot of benefit from this guy. He's kind of busted, but he's the villain in a mythic 6-drop. It better be good. And this feels like a flavorful way of showing the power of this, the Dark Lord of the whole frickin' story. All right, next up, we want to talk about Sauron's Lieutenant, the Witch King of Angmar. This is a 5/3 flyer for 3 black, Wraith Noble, legendary. Whenever one or more creatures deals combat damage to you, each opponent sacrifices a creature that dealt combat damage to you this turn, and the ring tempts you. Discard a card. Witch King of Angmar gains indestructible until end of turn, and tap it. So it's a discard outlet, meaning you can fill your graveyard, but that also just protects the Witch King, and for as long as the Witch King is around, there's this, like, pseudo no mercy effect on the Witch King. If you're not familiar with no mercy, it's an enchantment, I believe it's a 4-drop, that says whenever a creature deals combat damage to you, destroy that creature. Or I believe that creature's owner sacrifices it. But the thing dies if it hits you. In the case of the Witch King of Angmar, if your opponent hits you with multiple creatures, they only lose one of them, but they still have to lose one of them. And it's only of the creatures that dealt damage to you. So if the Witch King is back on defense, and your opponent attacks you with 2 creatures, Witch King can block one of them, and then you can discard a card, give it indestructible so it doesn't die in combat, because it only has 3 toughness after all, as a 5-drop. That's notable. But, then the other creature gets in, deals combat damage to you, Witch King triggers, they sacrifice that creature. Boom. So this presents some really interesting situations. You may be able to, block in pretty creative ways and let damage through to you and still force specific creatures to become to be sacrificed that wouldn't otherwise. So I think that's really solid. And then you also get the ring tempting you as an extra little bonus. And then the Witch King could become your ring bearer if you don't already have one, and you're off to the races and good things are happening. Yeah, so I think this card is actually pretty strong, but it doesn't read like a super powerhouse, but it looks really solid in a lot of ways. And cards that kind of check those boxes, in my opinion, are oftentimes better than they look. Putting 5 power in the air on a 5-drop can already be worth the price of admission in some cases. I think in Limited, this card is an absolute house. Bomb and a half. Just pack one, pick one, no question, get it. In Constructed, honestly, I'm going to run this. Like, I'm going to build a couple of janky decks that leverage this to cool effect. If I care about the ring tempting me, if I care about, if I want to tax my opponent and force them to deal with, like, uncomfortable situations, being able to, like, punish them for dealing damage to me is pretty cool. I like that. Because I'm going to block my face anyway, but if anything happens to get through, it dies also. I mean, in a black themed or black heavy aggressive deck, this as a curve topper could actually be pretty fun. I like it. That's really the bottom line. I think this card is actually just really solid. Looking at it, it's not necessarily something I would want to build a commander deck around, but it could be done. But it's definitely the kind of thing that I want to see. I want to play this in Standard for sure. Well, I want to play in Standard. It's not Standard legal. I suspect it's probably not going to be strong enough for Modern. But in Historic, on Arena in Historic, this card will probably see play somewhere. I know I'm probably going to end up using it at some point or another. Anyway, I like it. Heck, I might even try Alchemy, because who knows? In Alchemy, this card is probably going to be really good. But there are a handful of cards in Alchemy from the digital design pace that are a little, that I think might push out cool designs like this. In any event, cool card. I like him. Dude's a freaking house who is one of the most powerful leaders of the forces of evil in the books. So he's got to be good. I think he is here. Good stuff. Next up, talking about a card that probably is good enough to see some play in Modern. Now, I personally, disclaimer, I don't currently play Modern. Not yet anyway. I'd like to at some point. But I hear rumblings, and I've heard from a lot of people who do play Modern that this card looks really freaking good in a couple of those decks, and I'm inclined to believe it. So Orcish Bowmasters is the card we're talking about. It is a 1/1 flash for 1 and a black. When Orcish Bowmasters enters the battlefield and whenever an opponent draws a card, except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmaster deals 1 damage to any target, then amass Orcs 1. So, the amass Orcs being tied to this is kind of insane. So if you think about it, you get this trigger once no matter what. So what you're actually doing, if you don't have an army down, which presumably you don't because it's a 2-drop, you want to be getting this down early. You play your second land, on your second turn, you pass to your opponent, they do their thing, on their end step, you throw it on Orcish Bowmasters. And then as a result, you get a 1/1 in the Bowmasters themselves, but you also get a 1/1 in your Orc army. Best case scenario though, if you're, say, on the draw, your opponent is on 3, they cast like a Thirst for Discovery or something like that. In response to it, you throw the Orcish Bowmasters. This is kind of a goofy scenario, but just go with me. In older formats, imagine if you do this in response to a Brainstorm. What would end up happening is Orcish Bowmasters hits the battlefield. It triggers, you make the zombie army, and then you ping them or ping their Delver of Secrets or whatever the case may be for 1. They then draw 3 cards in either of those cases. And whenever an opponent draws a card except the first one, well, okay, these are not the first cards that they've drawn because this is a Brainstorm or a Thirst for Discovery on their turn. They draw 3 cards. Orcish Bowmasters then triggers 3 separate times. You now have 3 additional damage, and you're not sitting on a 4/4. This is all because you cast a 2-drop on their turn. That seems freaking amazing to me. So granted, that's kind of a very specific scenario, but that's something that you could do on turn 2. That seems bananas. Honestly, I think the potential for this card is very, very strong. And then other cards that allow your opponent to draw a lot of cards, like we're seeing it a lot in Standard right now with like the, Flow of Insight, the 5-drop in blue where you draw a card for every island you control. Or there's also, there's the Convoke card that allows you to draw a bunch of cards too, Silver Scrutiny, those kind of things. You see opponents drawing a lot of cards. It's just something that happens. And so being able to capitalize on that and punish them for doing so, that is powerful. That is meaningful. This card seems just really freaking strong. You get a lot for 2 mana. And the flash, the fact that you get to surprise your opponent with it is incredible. Now, it is only 1/1. It's going to die to a lot. But even so, the benefit, the value that you get off this thing, it's really legit. I like it a lot. Yeah. Then you can also include this alongside things like Fairy Mastermind or, was it Lorn of the Third Path that can tap and draw your opponent's cards? Like, if you can draw your opponent's extra cards and then punish them for it through your Bowmasters, like, that seems great. Yeah, I'm going to have a lot of fun building around this, and I think this is a card that we're going to see a lot of. It's super efficient, and you get just killer value, top to bottom. All right, next card I want to talk about is Gollum Scheming Guide. This is a 2/1 halfling horror for 1 and a black. I think the legendary halfling horror is kind of the perfect type line for Gollum because he was one of the river folk, which were like the ancestors of, the modern day or third age halflings in the Lord of the Rings stories. So him being typed as a halfling does make sense. He is of that type. So anyway, and being a 2/1 kind of makes sense. He's grown frail, and so he's not a 2/2 like the other halflings. But, although he has some wiry strength going to him. So, honestly, they could have made him a 3/1 and I wouldn't have been mad. But anyway, whenever Gollum Scheming Guide attacks, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put them back in any order. Then choose land or non-land. An opponent guesses whether the top card of your library is the chosen kind. Reveal that card. If they guessed right, remove Gollum from combat. Otherwise, you draw a card, and Gollum can't be blocked this turn. So, Gollum will never be blocked. This card is designed in such a way that there is no situation in which Gollum Scheming Guide will become blocked. He is either going to connect with the opponent because he is unblockable, unless he eats a cut down or something, or he's going to be removed from combat. So he's either not a threat at all, or he is inexorable and he's going to hit you. So I like that design. Additionally, it gets you to play a little mini game with your opponent, which seems very reminiscent to me of the riddle game that Gollum and Bilbo got into in The Hobbit. So this idea of like, oh, I'm going to play a little game with you, but if you win, I show you the way out, but if I win, I eat you whole. It's got that vibe to it where it's like, if I win, I'm going to draw a card and you cannot stop me from hitting you. It's like, I'm going to take a bite out of you. But if you win, I'll back off and let you be. It kind of has that vibe, and that's fun. I think that's a really cool design. They nailed the character of Gollum. He's a scheming guy. He'll show you the way, but he's gonna mess with you in the process. And I feel like that, I don't know, I like it. It's pretty cool. So I think this design is just simply good. Honestly, I do kind of wish he was a 3-1 now, looking at it, because a 2-1 for 2, even one that might draw you cards and get in for some chip damage, still isn't, I don't know, it's just so small these days. There's so many different answers to a creature this little. So I don't think Gollum is going to see meaningful play outside of Commander, especially like flavorful theme decks, which are going to be sprouting up after this set. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see Gollum Scheming Guide as a Commander or something like that. Or in, I don't know, there might be theme decks where he fits. But I don't see halfling aggro or anything of that nature being a viable strategy that wants Gollum. Especially actually because halfling as a creature type, now that I think about it, it isn't really, black doesn't have a lot of support for that kind of a thing. With pretty much all of the hobbits that we've seen so far being white aligned, with the exception of Gollum. That said, he is a horror. So I suppose any horror themed decks out there could probably consider this guy, because I don't know, he's not bad. I like him. All right, next up that we're going to be talking about is none other than the mother-flipping balrog, Flame of Udun. This is a 7/7 trampling avatar demon for 3 black red. So 7/7 trampler for 5. Good stat line, good power, you like to see it. And it's legendary avatar demon. Whenever a legendary creature an opponent controls dies, put the Balrog Flame of Udun on the bottom of its owner's library. So one thing that we have not seen very often as of late are cards that are overstated with downsides. That's something that is kind of a relic of Magic's past. I mean, nowadays we see overstated creatures, like if they have green in it, they have just tons of upside. In situations like this where they don't, it would presumably just not have, but it just wouldn't have a meaningful downside. The fact that this card has a very strong, meaningful downside means that it's just not going to see play. Honestly, I don't believe the Balrog is playable because there are legendary creatures all over the place. If your opponent is not rocking any legendary creatures whatsoever, which in Commander is like almost impossible, and in a lot of other formats, it's not common. When you think about it, there are, when you think about staple creatures nowadays, the ones that see a lot of play in competitive formats, you have your Thalias, you have Sheoldreds, you have Rafine. You have these cards that represent named characters and are therefore legendary. Granted, there are plenty of examples that are counter to that, but the days of non-legendary creatures being the norm and legendary creatures being this rare exception are long over. We see legendary creatures all over the place. And so this is likely to trigger pretty frequently. Had this come out 15 years ago, this card would be absolutely phenomenal because that's never going to happen. Who's running legendary creatures? You're going to be great. But fortunately, unfortunately for us, we're not 15 years ago. We're in a Commander-designed world, so there's a lot of legendaries. And the fact that a legendary creature dying, the Balrog goes to the bottom of its owner's library. If you're a black mage, the bottom of your library, unless you're playing, there's one commander whose name is escaping me right now. I'm sorry, yell at me in the comments below. It's not Grimgrin, it's, that's gonna bug me. But in any event, there's one Rakdos commander who cares about the bottom of your library, in which case Balrog might be great for that deck. But pretty much everybody else if it goes to the bottom of your library, it's not in your graveyard. You're not going to draw it anytime soon. Your best hope is to shuffle your library and maybe see it again, or go tutor it up. But honestly, if I have a tutor, especially in black, where a lot of those are completely unlimited, why in the world would I go grab a vanilla 7 power trampler? Like, it just doesn't, like, the math on that doesn't check out. You can do a lot better. So honestly, I think this card is a massive dud, which is a shame because the balrog is freaking amazing. Now, from a flavor perspective, Gandalf had to sacrifice himself in order to take the balrog out. So I get, like, thematically, you know, the idea that the balrog takes down another creature, but you know, he ends up getting, or it ends up getting, like, you know, taken with, or struck down as a result. Sure, but I don't know. It's just a big thing. It's just a big creature, and honestly, it's not that much bigger than its stat line. This thing could have been a 9/9 because of that drawback, and I think it would have been okay. But like 7/7, it's just not big enough. You know, there are 7/7s for 5, I'm pretty sure, that like have a minimal downside, if any. And this just isn't there. Like, I don't know. I don't like it. Which is a shame, because I do like the balrog. It has an opportunity to be really cool. It's a big dumb Rakdos creature. I want to like big dumb Rakdos creatures. Anyway, next up, we have the Nazgul. This is a 1/2 for 2 and a black with Death Touch. When Nazgul enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. Whenever the ring tempts you, put a +1/+1 counter on each wraith you control. And a deck can have up to 9 cards named Nazgul. So I like this idea of you may have extra cards. Like we saw it with the 7 dwarves too. Like Nazgul are actually pretty similar to the 7 dwarves in that regard, which honestly, this is probably the only context in which you can make the comparison between those two characters, but it's true. So in this case, the Nazgul being a 1/2 for 3, it ETBs, and the ring tempts you immediately, and it puts a +1/+1 counter on itself. So it looks like a 1/2 for 3. It's actually, functionally, it's a 2/3 for 3, which is way better. Like 2/3 for 3 with Death Touch, not bad. But then if you have multiple Nazgul, which you will want to do if you're running one, you're gonna want to run 9. Almost guaranteed. I cannot imagine a world in which you don't. And in that case, as you play additional copies of Nazgul, the ring is going to tempt you multiple times. And so you're going to be running through the ring tempts you emblem very quickly. So you're going to get a lot of those bonuses. But every time you do, your army that is made up of these Nazgul and potentially other wraiths bump up dramatically. On top of that, every Nazgul is going to have a copy of the text. Whenever the ring tempts you, put a +1/+1 counter on each wraith you control. So if you have 3 wraiths down, so imagine this. Okay, you have 2 Nazgul already. They already have a number of counters on it. I'm not going to do the math. You can, you know, it is what it is. They got a lot of counters. You play the 3rd Nazgul. The ring tempts you. Cool. So you now have 3 Nazgul online. The ring tempts you. You take the next step in the chain. And then all 3 Nazgul trigger and put a +1/+1 counter on each wraith 3 separate times. So each one gets 3 additional counters on top of everything else they have. That's freaking sweet. If you have other cards that allow the ring to tempt you, like these things could actually snowball out of control stupid fast. If you can get multiple of them online, the amount of power that you get on the board is pretty shocking. And on top of that, each one of them has Death Touch. So they're going to be able to block your face perfectly as they're growing to the point where they can become this overwhelming stampeding force, which, come to think of it, in the beginning of the story, of the Fellowship, if I'm not mistaken, or when the Nazgul are first brought up, it's just, they're described as like having gathered their power and finally been able to like take mortal form or take like physical form rather, and you know, venture out into the world of man. And then we also see them growing in power throughout the stories. Like they're a lot tougher in the Battle of Pelennor Fields versus when the hobbits are running away from them in the Shire. It's a very different vibe. They're much more impressive later on. And so I think it makes sense that these things grow in power as the game progresses and as the ring tempts you, as the ring is gathering its control over you, the player. Then the Nazgul under your control will grow in power. I love that. I think it's actually pretty fun. On top of that, if you can do anything that like allows you to make copies of these guys. If you have like a commander deck themed around this, you could also fill in with changelings. They are wraiths, so they will get counters whenever the ring tempts you. Like I said, anything additional way to copy the ring tempting you mechanic, it could get out of hand. Honestly, these things are just really cool. I like them. I'm going to be playing a lot with them. This is my kind of nonsense right here. All right, and then lastly, there's one other card I want to talk about. This is actually a common that is part of a really big panorama. A couple of the artworks that we've looked at today are actually part of a panorama that depict like one of the major battles that takes place. It's freaking sweet, by the way. If you haven't had an opportunity to look at the full images for those, definitely go look it up. It's great. But the last one I want to talk about is Mirkwood Bats. This is a card that has gotten a lot of hullabaloo. It's funny, I've heard a couple of people commenting that they don't think it's going to be as powerful as other people say, but I don't know. I've heard some other people saying that it's going to be like a massive menace in Historic on Arena, and we're going to see this card a lot. I do think it's going to be a staple commander card for a lot of different decks. I don't know that it's going to be that bad in 60 card constructed. In any event, I'm getting ahead of myself. Mirkwood Bats, 3 into black for a 2/3 flying bat. Whenever you create or sacrifice a token, each opponent loses 1 life. So the decks that really want this, I think, are decks leveraging treasure, because every time you create a treasure, each opponent loses 1 life. Every time you sacrifice a treasure, each opponent loses 1 life. So simply leveraging what is the mana base, or a portion of the mana base, in a lot of decks just gets these things to turn into a machine gun. You'll also notice this does not say this ability triggers only once per turn, which is text that we've kind of become accustomed to with effects like this. So I do think this card has a lot of play. If you have a token heavy deck in, say, Commander, then this is great. Actually, it's come to think of it, I have an Orzhov Commander deck that builds a lot of tokens. It does a lot with, generating specifically might tokens. And so all of a sudden, Mirkwood Bats being in the mix, being able to just, every time I create 4 or 5 mites at a time, Mirkwood Bats ping my opponent for that many time, ping my opponents that many times, that's really good. Like, that's really good. And it's any token. So blood, food, any creature tokens, it's all viable. It all counts. Like, you make a reflection, you have the reflection of the mirror breaker down, you tap it to make a copy of a thing, that's a token, ping your opponent. At the end of the turn, you have to sacrifice it. Boom, you've sacrificed a token, ping your opponent again. Little things like that could add up a lot to generate a ton of life loss throughout the course of a game. That said, Mirkwood Bats is a 4-drop. A lot of typical sacrifice decks will go up until like 3 mana or so, but they have a ton of 1 and 2 mana, spells and effects that create creatures or blood or treasure or whatever the case may be, and sacrifice them to create loops. And if you have too much expensive payoff in those kind of decks, the actual engine that gets the whole thing running doesn't really start. And so Mirkwood Bats is one of those things where I don't see it really popping off and being a massive threat in that style of a deck, because in a lot of competitive environments, that is just too easily answered. We have seen Rakdos sacrifice decks in recent like Explorer tournaments, for example, that have, granted, this won't be Explorer legal, unfortunately, but I'm sure it would extrapolate to Historic as well, where Mayhem Devil is like the 3-drop that the deck really wants to take advantage of, and you may see like Obnixilis Captive Kingpin at 4. And if that survives, it's dealing additional damage to your opponent. It's drawing you additional, well, yeah, it might, because in combat, you're going to be able to attack and deal damage. It has the potential of being a big punch in the air to the opponent, and it's also drawing you effectively drawing you cards in the case of impulsive draw. So it's a very, very potent, very powerful top end for that deck. But in the games that I've seen it, where Rakdos players have tried to leverage that, the moment it drops, it gets removed. I know saying something dies to removal is not, it's not an efficient, it's not enough of, I can't say because this creature will die if removed, the creature is a bad card to begin with. That is not a logically coherent thread. The truth of the matter is, though, Mirkwood Bats is a 4-drop creature that doesn't protect itself and has a low stat line. And so as a result, it is much more vulnerable to removal than a lot of other 4-drops you might see. And it's at a time, and it wants to fit into a deck where a 4-drop might not fit anyway. So it's kind of a tall order to try to make this fit. If this was a 3-drop and maybe a 1/2 for, or something, it would be incredible. At 4, I think it is just a little out of reach. So it's a good common. Also, come to think of it, I wouldn't be surprised if there are pauper decks that'll be able to take advantage of this. That's a whole other discussion. I don't know the I don't know the meta in pauper well enough to say whether or not this is going to be good, but I'll be shocked if it's not. Let me put it that way. Yeah, because it is a strong card. Mirkwood Bats is a strong common, especially in like artifact token-based strategies. The potential here is absolutely real, and I'm looking forward to trying it. But I don't think it's going to make a competitive splash like on the pro scene, even in viable decks. Commander decks are going to love this thing, though. If you're doing anything with tokens and Commander and you have black, think about adding this. Anyway, yeah, thank you so much for checking out this edition of the Overthinking MTG podcast. I really appreciate it. I do try to put out episodes multiple times a week. A lot of times I look at individual cards. Sometimes like this, especially during spoiler season, I'm willing to open it up a little bit and take a look at a few more. So thank you very much for checking this out. If you enjoy this, please like and subscribe if you're on the YouTube, or if you're on podcasting apps such as Spotify or whatever. Please follow the show. It actually makes a huge difference and really helps me out. So thank you so much. I'll catch you on the next one.